So our presenter tonight, Clive Harris, began birding as a young boy with his father in Hong Kong. His favorite birds are scoping birds, gulls, shorebirds, and waterfowl. And he says one of his greatest pleasures is sorting through a flock of late summer peeps. One of Montgomery Bird Club's most accomplished birders, Clive has served as president of the MBC and also served 2 terms on the MOS Maryland, DC Records Committee. So please join me in welcoming Clive as he talks about shorebird identification in the Mid-Atlantic.
Hey, I hope that all of this is working, both for people online. I hope you guys can hear me, and I think you can hear me in the room. I think there's a microphone, but if not, tell me and I'll just speak up. So it's great to be here presenting once again on the topic of shorebirds. And I was struggling to remember how I was asked and how I agreed to do this. And I think it's because somehow I put that line in about sorting through flocks of peeps, and I think that must have been why I was asked to do that. But that is one of my pleasures in life, actually. Oh, we need to go back one. I can just sort of look through a flock of shorebirds without expecting to find anything rare, but I can look through it in August or September for a couple of hours at a time. And it's great to have Cindy Loper, who was a longtime member of the club. And I think the first field trip that the club did that I ever went on was a 2-day trip to the Delaware Bay back in 1996 when Cindy was, I don't know whether you were leading that, but you're on it anyway. And that was a lot of fun. That was one of my first Delaware Bay shorebirding experiences. Before I get into this, I'm going to say that, to my knowledge anyway, every bird I show you is edible. And actually, some ways it's a more serious matter, because at one point, I think it was mostly in the 19th century, shorebirds were extensively hunted in fall for, to sell in markets. That was one of the contributing factors, I think, for the extinction of the Eskimo curlew. And also birds like, the American golden plover, they were hunted a lot. I guess these birds were shot just as they were fattening up for their fall migration. So anyway, but you've got to cook them all pretty thoroughly, I think, given where they feed. Okay, so I'm going to go through most of the species you'd expect to see here. I'm not going to cover everything. For example, I'm not going to talk about, apologies to woodcock fans, but you guys already saw a picture of a woodcock anyway, a very nice one, so you don't need to see another one, but I wasn't going to cover them because, you don't see them hanging around with other shorebirds. It's not really an ID challenge. And if we've got enough time, we'll get to some rare species, but I want to go through the ones that you'll mostly expect to see. And there's a few quiz type things as well. So, well, first of all, this is a picture I took when I was in last December in San Diego. I think most of you know this is a marble godwit. It's a gorgeous bird. It was probably only about 100 feet from me. It's kind of all field mark, this bird, isn't it? Beautiful color, this sort of rusty buff color, big long bill. I don't know why Michael Bowen has suddenly appeared on that for us, but good to see you, Mike. Okay. Anyway, but unfortunately, distinctive as though that is, the tough thing about shorebirds is it's usually not like this. So I'm trying to advance it now, and it's not advancing. Perhaps it was Mike appearing and disappearing. Okay, this is what it's usually like. In fact, this is a pretty decent view. They're often further away than this. We're often looking at shorebirds in summer, a lot of heat, haze and everything. But, most of the year, shorebirds well, first of all, they're often not very close to you. Secondly, they're mostly kind of grayish brown. Some are brownish gray. Some are dark grayish brown, and some are light grayish brown. But, you get the picture. Very few actually look distinctive most of the year. There's this brief window, in the second half of May, early June, when they're all rushing through this area, heading north to the Arctic to breed, when some of them, not all of them, some of them are very colorful. That's kind of a blink and you can miss it type thing, because when they come back in mid-July and August, they faded and worn, etc. So a lot of the time you're dealing with birds that aren't terribly distinctive. We're going to come back to this picture, but I'm just curious. I'm just going to linger on it. There's a number of different shorebird species in there. I'm just wondering what people's guess are about the number of species that we can see in this picture. Anyone want to hazard a guess? I forget. I did try and work it out, but I actually can't remember. 10 and 12 would be pretty good for that. I don't think it's quite that high. We'll come back to it. I think it's about 7 or 8 probably, but I don't want to jump into it now because that would be going into some of the ID stuff. Okay, so what do we do if we have this issue? And okay, so there's actually 4 things, but I've got 3 on this slide, which are really helpful. The first is shape. If you look at the left-hand side, these are basically silhouettes of birds, and a huge amount of shorebirding goes on shape. And anyone who's been shorebirding for a while, they will just sift through a flock of shorebirds looking at the shape, as well as the size, but the shape is a huge clue. And an experienced shorebird, if you look on the left-hand side, so this top one, they would go straight over that because that's a lesser yellow legs. They wouldn't pause on that. They'd immediately recognize the lesser yellow legs and carry on. And they would come to a halt on that one, which is actually a Hudsonian godwit. You can see via profile it's a godwit, and it's got a long wings sticking out from the end of the tail. We'll get into that. That's not the Hudsonian godwit talk. But that's a really important thing to learn, is to learn the shape of these birds. And they're quite distinctive. Second is the size. You can see this is a clip from the picture we just saw. Shorebirds are different sizes, and that's super helpful. Actually, one of the hardest things to do is, in one of these gray-brown shorebirds, it's all by itself and it's off in the distance, and you're looking at it thinking, how big is that bird? Because there's nothing else to compare it to. But if you got 2 shorebirds together, different species, it's much easier. Then another thing to do, particularly in fall, is to try to understand what age the bird is, and that can be really helpful. So for those of you, I'm pointing to this, but for those of you viewing online, if you look at the right-hand panel, the top one is an adult taken probably in August. It's a semi-palmated sandpiper. Below it is a semi-palmated sandpiper juvenile. These may have been taken in the same day, I don't know. But the one at the bottom, you can see has got these beautifully neat feathers. They're all, very pristine. They're all quite small, lots of nice edging to them, etc. And that can be really important and very helpful in trying to clinch shorebird ID. So adults in late summer, they will be kind of messy and worn and, a mixture of different color feathers. The juveniles look very uniform and pristine. The one thing I haven't put down, and I won't be going into it because I wasn't, I didn't want to embed calls, is it's really helpful to learn shorebird calls. And if you're not used to learning bird calls, that may sound difficult, but actually it isn't, because there aren't that many to learn. There's probably only about 10 or 12 shorebirds that call a lot, and they're all kind of quite different, all very distinctive. And a lot of time when I'm out shorebirding, I will be hearing stuff before I see it. I'll be like, oh, okay, there's some long-billed dowitches around. I just heard one, and then I'll start looking for them more. It's much easier than somebody saying, oh, go and learn warbler flight calls. It's like, no, thank you. But shorebirds, much easier. Okay, so with that, I'm going to go through different groups of shorebirds, and hopefully we'll have time for the whole presentation, but I don't know how long this presentation takes. I've not given it before, so I'm going to rely on Emily to signal when we're running near time. And as I said, we'll get to there's some rare stuff at the end we may get to, we may not, I just don't know. So let's jump in. Yeah, it's not advancing. Okay, great. We'll start with the peeps, which are the smallest birds. I don't know why they're called peeps, because none of them actually make a call that sounds like a peep, at least not to my knowledge, but there we are. And the most common one, when you get to the coast, certainly, is the semi-palmated sandpiper for much of the summer. And of course, which is a lot like the western sandpiper. I think you guys probably know that. There are differences in bill length, which sometimes are really helpful. If you look at the bird on the bottom right, which may well be a female, many of the shorebirds are females, are bigger and have longer bills, not all of them. But they have the longest bills, and that's a really long bill bird. it's not always helpful because sometimes, and this top one, this very bright bird is actually a male Western sandpiper, and its bill doesn't look any longer than the two birds on the left. I've never seen, by the way, a Western sandpiper this bright as the top right-hand bird in along the Delaware Bay, which is where I do my shorebirding in spring. They seem to pull out before then. That picture was taken in Alaska. But I put it up there because actually some of the semi-palmated sandpipers can kind of mimic what we think of the Western sandpiper pattern. They've got rufous on the head and a bit on the back, the scapulars, which is what that's known as. But they're nowhere near as bright as a breeding one. But a lot of them are quite dull. They've got black legs. They're very small. It's a really common, if you go to the Delaware Bay in late May, they're very common there. And when these birds come back, and they return pretty quickly, they fall migration for shorebirds. Actually, some of the short-billed dowitches come back at the end of June. These guys start coming back in early July. They're the failed breeders, or the females leave early, the males with the young in some cases. And so these guys start to look kind of worn, and they're actually quite, to some extent, a bit easier to tell apart. Semi-palmated versus Western sandpaper is one of the toughest IDs to make, which is one of the reasons I've started with it, because you guys may get tired of the talk halfway through, but I'll do this while it's all fresh. It's a tough ID because there is this overlap in bill length. They're both small, they're often far away. It's kind of hard to tell. But one thing that's kind of helpful is that if you're birding in the middle of summer, shorebirding in the middle of summer, a lot of the Western sandpipers, and I'm looking at this bottom right one for you guys joining online, they're quite advanced in molt. So they look kind of messy. The head looks a very uneven pattern. They're starting to get quite a lot of new feathers on the upper parts. Quite distinctive is they will retain some of this rufous, but they look kind of worn and messy. Whereas even though the semis do also start to look worn, they're not as, they look more like the birds in spring. They often still have a very dark cheeks. They get this overall grayish brown color. And so that type of thing is kind of helpful. It's often easiest to start by trying to find the birds with the longest bill for sure. But there is overlap as we can see here. So I'm gonna whoops a daisy. Okay. So, and then midway through August, the young birds start to appear. Probably not in good numbers till late August, right at the end. And they can also be pretty tricky. So Western sandpiper are quite well known for having these very rufous scapulars, and that can be really helpful. The bird on the top right is really quite grayish on most of the wing, then the scaps are very bright rufous. It's helpful that both of these birds have got long bills. But semi-palmated sandpipers can also have a fair bit of rufous on them. This bird, for example, is quite short-billed. So, just the presence of rufous alone doesn't necessarily help. One thing that often helps is that it's really bright rufous and very bold on the Western sandpiper. But again, you may say, well, the easiest thing to do is there's generally more semi-palmated sandpipers at that time of year. And the thing you might want to do is pick out Westerns, start with the birds that have got the longest bills. The other thing I always find is a good character as well is the cap. It's often very dark on the semi-palmated sandpiper, dark cap, very dark cheeks. And although that is somewhat replicated with the Western sandpiper, they tend to be paler headed as well. And also, if you get a good enough view, which you don't always get, but if you do get a good enough view, very early into September, a lot of the juvenile Western sandpipers will start to show gray feathers on the back. They tend to winter a lot further north than the semi-palmated sandpipers, which pretty much mostly move out of the US. Whereas Western sandpipers kind of rare in our area, but winter all the way down the Atlantic coast. And so if you see a juvenile bird, and we know these are juveniles, we go back to that thing earlier, they've got this very neat pattern on them. Feathers all look very uniform in terms of age and everything. You can see these plain gray feathers, which I've pointed some arrows to on the Western sandpipers, which you just don't see on the semi-palmated sandpipers. That's always a great thing. So now it's not always easy to tell these. So I took this picture of a group of peeps. They all look kind of similar. which is a challenge. So I'm not saying, you know, some of these IDs aren't easy. So if you go out and think, oh, I'm going to practice with this, you'll find it won't be straightforward. That's, you know, the nature of it. And then, you know, there are some birds I don't try to ID necessarily if I don't get a great view, if I'm not entirely sure. And it's perfectly fine to do that, by the way. But it's also good to ID, you know, what you can. So, you know, you can, if you ID say 20% of the birds, that's great, and that's a start. So, well, let's I don't know how easy it is to do this online, but I'm just first going to turn to the room. I'm just wondering, which ones there do people think might be Western sandpipers? Any guesses? Sorry? Lower, this one? Anything else? Okay, well, that's fine. There's no, okay. I'm just now, what is it that you guys, first of all, the lower left, what was it that you, what made you think that this was a Western sandpiper? Okay, yeah, okay. Okay, quite rusty there. And I think somebody said this one, right? Okay, why did you say that? It's correct, by the way, but I'm just wondering why you, yes, it does, yeah. You know, it does have a long bill. I'm not sure it's any longer than that one, but you're right, it is quite long. And there is overlap, right? So there's overlap. The longest billed semi-sandpipers have longer bills than the shortest billed Western sandpipers. So here's what, you know, it's been a few years since I took this. So that was my guess as well. I think all of these are semis. They have very dark caps. Some have got quite short bills. You know, really, you know, very dark cap birds. This one is a short-billed bird. And these two are Westerns. You can see the gray feathers there and the very bold rufous. The cap is a little bit paler. But of course, you know, this was a pretty good view. So, you know, you've got to be prepared that some of these views are going to be difficult. And you take what you can, you know, some of the stuff you just let go. The stuff you can, you identify. And there's, and that makes it all easier. And, you know, maybe next time it's a bit more straightforward. So I'm going to move on with the peeps. This is the smallest, actually, this is the smallest shorebird in the world, I believe, the least sandpiper. It's, you know, probably about as numerous as the others, but often you don't see it in the big flocks because they don't, you know, they tend to be at the margins of big impoundments. They like hanging around the grass and on the mud. They don't go in big flocks in the center of it because they are very small. They're always very brown in whatever plumage are in least sandpipers. In spring, the adults are kind of rusty a bit, but very brown. They have these yellow legs. The other two are black legs. A bit of caution on that because mud can get on legs, etc. They often, you can see, I always think they kind of, you know, they almost scared that the sky is going to fall on their heads. They go around crash like this, you know, and that's how they feed. And they are very small. The bill is a very distinctive shape. The head is small. This sort of very fine tipped, slightly curved bill. The juveniles are really distinctive, and they appear quite early, right at the end of July, start of August. It's really bright rufous color with white stripes on the back. And, you know, you could be looking through birds, you know, even without scope, and you see in fall. And you'll see these really bright rufous birds, which are going to be the least sandpipers and kind of, you know, the ones we saw earlier, a bit more grayish brown on the other birds, etc. So super distinctive, pretty common in Montgomery County in fall because they like grassy areas. So they will show up on, you know, well, when they didn't used to cut the grass on the turf, on the polo grounds quite as much, they used to be there quite a lot, but can take a little bit of care to distinguish from the semi-palmated sandpiper, particularly in spring. Actually, the colors are most similar, I find. You know, they're both quite rich brown. But in fall, as they wear, the adults, least sandpipers get this really dark brown color, and the semi-sands tend to get a more of a grayish brown. So you can kind of ID them almost on color alone. When you're filtering, that's one of the filtering tricks, you know, like the shape. The the juveniles, these are two juveniles again. Look at those lovely, neat feathers on both of them. And the least sandpipers, they've, you know, very little variation in the color of those. They're always this type of color. There's another juvenile, always this really rich brown color. Sometimes the leg color is super obvious, sometimes it isn't. And one thing to watch out for is, here's a juvenile semi-palmated sandpiper, which can also be quite rich color. They're the most variable. Some of them are just very gray like this bird. Some of them have a lot of rufous on them. And the legs, they're not the black of the adult. They're this sort of olive color in the juvenile semi-palmated sandpipers. But, you know, when you see them together, they're larger. They're kind of a different shape with a bigger head. They have a longer projection of the primaries past the wings, etc. But color is helpful a lot of the time. Again, sometimes, you know, you're looking at distant views, it might be a bit tricky. But I often find that the typical stance of least sandpipers is really helpful. This crouching all the time that they go around doing. I'm just going to do a quick time check as well to understand where we are. Okay. All right. Well, we're carrying on with these smallish birds. The birds will get slightly larger as we go through. They'll steadily get bigger and bigger. Okay. I did a double then. So sometimes classed with the peeps, slightly larger, are the white-rumped and bared sandpipers. White-rumped is by far the easiest one to see in the region. You get small numbers pass through in late May. Then they start turning up on the coast and also here occasionally from midsummer onwards. And they stick around quite late. These are, if you go shorebirding in October, and I might mention this several times, but shorebirding in late September through October is really good. Yeah, I know most people stop shorebirding in the summer, but some of the rarest species are easier to find in October than they are in the middle of July or August. And white-rumped sandpipers are certainly around. For both of these species, a distinctive thing compared to the peeps, which they're not much bigger than, is just how long their wings project well past the tail. And both of these birds, a lot of them fly all the way down to Patagonia to winter. And that's kind of, you know, fairly common pattern, is the birds that fly the furthest have relatively the longest wings. And of course, the white-rumped sandpiper is pretty distinctive because when it flies, it has this little white patch there. It's the only bird of that size that really has it. And the adults have, they look a little bit like that semi I showed earlier. They're fairly bright in terms of they have a little bit of rufous on the crown and the ear coverts. They have these little arrowheads down along the flanks and on the breast. But it's really the long length that alerts you to them at first. Bared sandpiper is a bird that we only see really in the fall, and it's a pretty tough bird to connect with for whatever reason. They you know, often don't like typical shorebird habitat. They like sort of muddy areas, you know, turf farms perhaps. And you know, it's kind of different. It's much plainer above. It doesn't have the white rump, but is even longer winged than the white-rumped sandpiper. And to make this point about shape and how it's helpful to have a bunch of shorebirds around, last year on a trip to Poplar Island, and if we have time, I'll have a map for those of you who don't know about shorebird destinations. Poplar Island is one of these dredge islands in the Chesapeake Bay. A number of us managed to locate a bared sandpiper that must have been, I don't know, it was further than a quarter of a mile away. And the reason we could do it is we could see it was feeding with peeps, and it was slightly longer than the peeps, but no taller. So it wasn't a pectoral. And it was a buffy color on the breast, which you can kind of see here. And it also had very distinctive feeding action. But, you know, if you'd seen it by itself, you would have had no chance of IDing it, really. It wasn't possible, but we could tell because of what it was with. Now, if you go birding in Arizona in August, which some people do, I've done a number of times, and you go to a wetland there, you will see a lot of bared sandpipers. They're actually very common, but they just don't pass through our area. They're probably the commonest small shorebird if you go to an inland site, say in Arizona, or actually throughout the Intermountain West, in fact, one of the most common birds. And white-rumped sandpipers, not, you know, they're they're uncommon. I wouldn't say they're rare. They're uncommon here. I was in the Dakotas, and it was the most common shorebird that I saw in spring. So, it's all regionally different. There are some possible confusions. So the pectoral bottom left is a long-shaped shorebird, but the wings and the tail are about the same length. But it does look similarly long when you're first scanning through and you see some peeps and then you see a peck. It looks much longer. But Baird's and white rump, the wings project well past the tail. White rumped is bigger than semi-palmated sandpipers, but often not by very much. This is a very worn white rumped sandpiper, and here's a juvenile semi-sand. And so sometimes if the view's not great, they won't look a lot bigger. And people often say, well, one way to look at the Baird's, apart from the wing length and the buffiness, is its scaly upper parts. Well, you've got to be a bit careful about using that because lots of these birds have scaly upper parts. Here's a semi-palmated sandpiper, but it's got short wings and it doesn't have that buffiness. And just a quick note on leg color. That bird actually, to me right now, it looks like it's got slightly green legs, and that's, it should have, the legs are actually black, but that's just because of what it was walking in. It's tracked the color. Okay, so sanderlings are actually, just because of where we normally see these birds, it's easier. They're usually right on the beaches, although they do congregate with other shorebirds in flocks on the Delaware Bay in late May, but usually on the ocean beaches. And we most often see them in the top right, the winter plumage, which is this really pale gray. Always plenty of them around at Ocean City. These are two breeding plumage birds on the left. And the one at the bottom is super bright. You see some of those like this in late May, early June. And some of them look a bit like that when they first come back in midsummer. But actually they lose that super fast. Like I was saying, in some extent, this is the most blink and you'll miss it breeding plumage shorebird for me. You see the super bright ones only very rarely. If you go up to northern Alaska, you'll see them. And the juveniles are really distinctive. I've got this picture on the bottom right with a semi-palmated sandpiper. They're, distinctly bigger than the peeps. There isn't any overlap. And they're really nice color, these juvenile sanderlings. They're very black and white. Really dark feathers on the crown, ear coverts, and the upper parts. And actually, they'll retain quite a lot of that. In fact, if you go to Ocean City in the winter, you can tell which is an adult and which is not by looking at the wing coverts. And looking at this one, I think this is what we would call a first winter bird, because you can still see the pattern on the wing coverts there. That's a little bit of shorebirding in winter. An adult would have much plainer wings, I think. And it's a little bit on molt there. You can see the tertials are different colors. So it's obviously molting some tertials, which are the winter type. And those are the old juvenile ones with the strong white edges. So you can have fun with shorebirds even in the middle of winter. And there are, like 7 or 8 species that can be around our area in winter. Of which, speaking of winter shorebirds, this is the most numerous one, the dunlin. If you go to Bombay Hook in winter, there's lots of dunlin. Dunlin are, they breed across the world. And again, in this brief period in summer, they're very colorful. So colorful, I think one of the old names here, not in Britain, but here was the red-backed sandpiper. It's really bright red upper parts, but super distinctive, and is these black underparts. We don't have any sandpipers like that with the black underparts. Quite a long bill, about the same size as a sanderling, much bigger than peeps. We see them a lot in winter, where they're this very grayish color. And the juveniles, which this is a juvenile, they come back really late. In fact, dunlins come back if middle of summer. You don't really see. You might see 1 or 2 out of thousands and thousands of shorebirds at Bombay Hook in the middle of summer. But they mostly come back much later. The juveniles don't come back till mid-September really, by which time they're already starting to molt. And kind of slightly similar is the Western Sandpiper, particularly longer billed ones, because they also have kind of a long bill. It's slightly different shape, as you can see. It's not as curved as the Dunlin. And Western Sandpiper, being a peep, is quite a bit smaller. So if they're together, you'll notice it. And they do winter in small numbers in Delaware and Maryland, Western Sandpipers. But they're paler. The gray is much paler. It's not this kind of where it gets the name from. It's not this dun color. And not to go on too, but I did mention about aging. So if you look at the wing coverts on this bird, what age do people think this? This is a bird of, I can't remember when I took this picture, whether it's late in the calendar year or early in the calendar year, but these are the juvenile wing coverts. They're like this. They're very boldly fringed, uniformly fringed compared to the upper parts. But Dunlin is super distinctive by its shape. Probably the most common shorebird in winter in the area in terms of numbers. Although you have to go to pick particular places to see it. Okay, great. Petrel sandpiper. So, as I mentioned, we're getting slightly bigger. Petrel sandpiper is actually one of those shorebirds in which there is a big size difference between, in this case, the males and the females. I think the males, I'm getting this correctly, I think this is one of the lacking shorebirds. There's a few shorebirds that lack. Ruff is the most famous one. But the males are a lot bigger. And so when you see a group of petrels, particularly in fall, when they're often gathered together, they're really different size. And the females are bigger than peeps, but not enormously so. The males are much bigger. They're named because of this band of dark streaking, which ends really abruptly on the chest. They are like the least sandpiper. They kind of like hanging around in grassy areas, by the margins. It's pretty common in Montgomery County. It is a turf farm type bird. They will turn up in what look to be dry habitats in turf farms, etc. And they're always kind of this brownish color, particularly bright in fall. The juveniles look, as I've shown here, you might think confusing this bird with the leaf sandpiper is kind of ridiculous, but actually the color pattern is basically the same. And so again, if you're looking at a really distant bird and you can't, measure it against anything, it's difficult to, it might be a challenge. So I've given, here you can see how similar in some ways they look. One big difference is the petrels have a long projection of the primaries past the tertials. They're much longer winged birds. They also go a long way south. A lot of them winter in southern South America. And in actual fact, they breed, so they come a long way. They breed a long way west or east. I guess it's west actually. But they do kind of look similar to the Lee sandpiper, but they're much bigger than in the peeps. So if you see them together, they shouldn't really be a problem. But again, the same leg color, this yellowish leg color. I'm looking at the bird on the right-hand panel. And so we're switching habitats a little bit. A lot of the birds we've been talking about are birds you will see, in impoundments, etc. Spotted sandpiper particularly is a bird that can turn up anywhere. It's very, as they might say, very Catholic. That's what they used to say. I'm not sure you say that these days. And it's choice of habitat. So you see them running along the beaches on the Delaware Bay. You see them along the Potomac. You'll see them if you go to a lake, and on the boat ramp, there might be a spotted sandpiper there. They're quite happy going in lots of different places. Sometimes alongside the solitary sandpiper, they don't actually look that similar, but they're in the same habitat. And if you don't see them very well at first, you might confuse them, particularly in fall plumage. In spring, they're very bright. They've got this bright bill and they've got lots of spots underneath, that hence the name. In fall, they're much plainer. Unlike some of the birds we saw earlier, the juveniles aren't bright. The juveniles are kind of dull, but they have this, they're kind of smallish and quite distinctive in the way they run around, but they also have this white spur up the front of the wing, which is unique to birds in this area. And so that helps tell it from, there's a juvenile solitary sandpiper on the bottom right, doesn't have that spur. if you see them together, they're quite a different size, but they, they could be in the same area, because solitary sandpipers typically like ponds, or you'll see them in the canal, part of the canal with water on it. They like that sort of thing. Less often along, I guess you can get them along the river sometimes, but you tend to see them if you're birding along the Potomac, and there's a open stretch of the canal, that's probably where the solitary sandpipers are. And we were covering all the birds we've looked at so far in the Calidris genus, which, they're birds that often like sort of picking and probing. And the solitary sandpiper is this, we'll cover a few now. It's what's known as a tringer. So they do a lot of picking. And in fact, it looks a lot like, keep on pointing this in the wrong direction, a slightly smaller version of the lesser yellowlegs, which is a pretty common bird in the area. You will see it all over the place. If you go to the coast, also very happy to turn up in ponds here if they're the right depth, etc. The only thing that really, you could confuse it a bit with the solitary sandpiper that we just saw, but the legs are longer on this bird. It's more elegant looking bird, and the legs are should be a more distinctly bright yellow. And the thing it's going to most look like on distant birds or birds by themselves is the greater yellow legs. And they're very similar in color pattern, particularly in juvenile plumage. And also when they're flying, both of them kind of look like this. If you lopped off the head of that bird and you were just looking at this, it may not be obvious whether it was a greater or a lesser yellow legs. So this species pair is definitely one of the ones where it's easiest to do if they're together. And I know a really distant yellow legs by itself, sometimes it's kind of hard to work out what it is. If it's running around on the far shore of a lake and it's the only bird there, not easy if it's very distant. One thing you can see on these 4 greater yellow legs is the bill shape is a bit different. It's often this slightly upturned and heavier. In breeding plumage, it could be helpful that these tend to be much more heavily marked, particularly on the underparts. But the easiest thing is really the shape. Here's the 2 birds together. There are several species pairs like this, but when you see them together, it's obvious which is which, but much harder when they're apart. But you see them together here, and I know this is not a great picture, but it's pretty typical actually. But you look at the overall size, the greater yellow legs probably weighs about maybe 2 or 3 times what a lesser yellow legs weighs. It's much longer. The bill is almost twice as long if you compare it to the head, etc. I mentioned calls earlier. The calls are extremely helpful as well on these 2 birds. Lesser yellow legs is often quoted as giving a double note, but you just got to be aware that it could actually, I've seen them do 50 notes in a row or 3, which is the greater yellow. So it's the pattern on the greater yellow legs. It's kind of, the call descends, it's 2-2-2, and the lesser yellow legs is much flatter. But the best ways to learn the calls is to get out in the field and listen to them. Listen to recordings first, then get out in the field. But again, a bird that you look at it and there's just one by itself, you might want to leave it. Much easier to tell when they're together. Okay, so we've kind of dipped back to some of the calidrid type birds, and I've done this because the stilt sandpiper is actually kind of similar in size and shape to a lesser yellow legs. It's uncommon, I would say, in the area. You do see them in spring. Top left is a spring adult bird. They're very attractive in spring. They've got this nice barred pattern on the underparts. I'm looking at the top left for those of you online. A lot of rufous on the cheeks, etc. Couple of distinctive things about stilt sandpipers is the bill is quite long and slightly decurved, and they spend a lot of, unlike lesser yellow legs. So lesser yellow legs I mentioned as a trinket, they pick, they don't probe. Darachers and stilt sandpipers probe for stuff. So which is what this bird on the bottom left is doing. They've labeled as a stilt sandpiper. They spend a lot of time with the beaks in the mud, and these birds have nerves at the beak that they detect prey with. Whereas I don't think the yellowlegs have that. They're very visual. They just pick stuff off the surface. Yellowlegs hunt for fish sometimes, etc. And also because it's small bodied and the legs are quite long, this is a really common, I'm looking again at the bottom left bird for you guys online that's labeled as stilt sandpiper, often tipped over. The backside is up in the air because the bill isn't super long. The legs are quite long. And you'll see fairly soon some picture of dowitchers which don't have to do that. Their bills are so long, they don't have to stick, their body up in there and a head down like that. They can quite happily reach that stuff. A lot of the time you're not seeing much of the bill. This is a first-year bird on the bottom right, as is the bird on the top right. You can see this nice patterning on the juvenile wings, and it's already starting to get some gray feathers in, which is the new winter plumage. Quite similar to the Dunlin. I mentioned the lesser yellow and the differences. It's not dissimilar to the Dunlin, and actually the body and bill are kind of almost the same size as Dunlin, but it's just much longer legged. So on the bottom left, I've labeled 2 juvenile Dunlin here and a stilt sandpiper, both birds that like to probe, quite long, slightly curved bills. And the Dunlin are much shorter legged. So they're, you can see here the water is up to their bellies, and the stilt sandpiper, it's well above that. Also kind of helpful is the stilt sandpipers always seem to have this nice eyebrow. It's very distinct white eyebrow. To some extent, the things you go on as shorebirds it's kind of personal. So, what I might use could be slightly different to what other people who look at shorebird, everyone keys on different things. I was talking earlier about Western and semi sandpipers. And the first thing I do when I'm scanning those birds is I'm looking at the heads, to see which ones have dark caps and which don't. I'm not saying that's necessarily foolproof. That's one of the filters that I use. And ditto, people might use different filters here. But stilt sandpiper is, as I said, it's uncommon. But if you go to the Delaware Bay, you go to Bombay Hook in August, you should see, maybe double figures of these. I think the most I've ever seen now is about 120, 130. Again, much more common in the Midwest. Okay, dowitchers, fun topic. There were one species until about the 1950s, I think. Then they were split. Actually, they are kind of different. They nest in short-billed and long-billed dowitchers nest in different areas. The long-billed dowitcher is an Arctic nesting bird. Short-billed dowitcher nests in the boreal forest and open areas in the boreal forest. And the calls are very different. Long-billed, in fact, I'm going to go into some of the field marks about shape and plumage, etc. But usually when I'm out shorebirding, the way I first realized there are long-billed dowitchers there. And in the middle of summer through August, they're much less common on the Delaware Bay than short-billed. But the reason how I notice them is I hear them first. They have a very distinctive peeping call, and they call a lot. They give the flight call and they're just hanging around feeding. So that's a useful thing to learn. And they both look the same, pretty much the same in flight. I'm going to come back to tail patterns in a second. But they're very similar. And a lot of the time in the middle of the thing, when there's many more short-billed dowitchers around, what you want to be doing is saying, okay, let's find a long-billed dowitcher, because there'll be many fewer. And I'm not sure, did I do that green line? Just wondering how that green line appeared. Okay. Be very useful if I could draw arrows to stuff. So we'll spend a little while on dowitchers because it is one of the trickier IDs, but actually there's a lot in there that you can work with. So start on the right-hand side with the short-billed dowitchers. And one of the important things to remember in spring and summer is that we get 2 types of short-billed dowitchers. We get the ones which breed in the east and ones which breed in the center of the continent. There's a third one which breeds on the Pacific, which fortunately we don't have to worry about. The top one on the right, if you're looking on the top right, the top bird in that is what's known as a Hendersoni short-billed dowitcher. So they have they're very bright birds. The entire underparts are this buffish color, rufous buff color, and they have pretty limited markings on the underparts. And the upper parts feathers that are breeding plumage are really bright, you know, really golden fringes, broad gold bars in them, as you can see. And then we also have the eastern birds, Griseus, which always have white from kind of like the middle of the bird, and sometimes even further forward. They're much duller. When they, you know, the rufous is often a bit redder, but much more limited and limited to the upper breast. So that's one important thing to remember. If we shift to the top left thing, we have a spring long-billed dowitcher, which we occasionally see, but I must admit, not that often. And if we focus first on the plumage, one of the things you can see is this quite deep reddish rufous color all the way through the underparts, and quite heavily marked in spring. They retain that color all the way through till September or so. And what you see in late summer actually is these long-billed dowitchers, which are very evenly, you know, quite deep reddish rufous below. More rufous than this, which is kind of a more orangey color to me, which is the Hendersoni. But they'll often have a gray face. For some reason, they molt the face first. That's very distinctive in terms of patterns. So that's one thing to remember, is we have multiple types of short-billed dowitcher. So you can eliminate most of the birds if you're trying to find your long-billed dowitcher. If they've got white on the underparts, clearly not that. If it's an even rufous, you know, color underneath, how dark is it, etc. One other thing, and we're going to look at that on the next slide, is shape. I'm going to come to that, you know, both how it's helpful, how it might not be helpful. But actually, they're easy to tell apart as juveniles. And juveniles, short-billed dowitchers come through pretty early in August, building up numbers at the end of August. They're often really bright. Many of them are even brighter than this bird. They have rufous in the crown and the upper parts. And the tertials and the scaps, all the upper part feathers, they've got lots of bold markings internal to the feathers. So, for example, this, I'm looking at the bird on the bottom right hand, for those of you online, and it's got these markings, indents in. It's not just a fringe, but these little tiger stripes almost. Long-billed dowitcher juveniles come through much later. I don't really see them until middle of September usually. And they're much plainer. They have, you know, these feathers here on the short-billed, which have got all these bright internal markings, completely lacking in the long-billed. The long-billed often look at the tertials for a late September juvenile dowitcher, and they're very plain here. And generally, they're much more plain. The wing covert's very plain. They don't have all of those internal markings. Yes. I will come to that. I'll come to that. Scott was asking a question about the bill. I'm going to go through a little bit more and then round some of this stuff up. So thank you. Can you go back actually? Oh, no, sorry. Okay, I'm sorry. That was my bad. Sorry, just go back to that slide. Sorry. I thought I had one in between, but I clearly don't. Okay, so there's a few other things as well. We've been talking about plumage, which I find is really helpful for juvenile birds in particular, and also helpful for adults. There's also shape differences and a few other differences. So, and sometimes these are really helpful, sometimes these are less helpful. So Scott asked about the bill. Yes, there are some birds which you could, if you measured the bill, there is overlap, but some long-billed dowitchers are longer billed than any short-billed dowitchers have ever been, and also the same at the other end of the spectrum. I often, you know, I find that not that easy to use to single out a bird. Once you're on a long-billed dowitcher and you've identified it through other means, it's often helpful to look at that. But if I did that and I looked at the bird and it didn't have a particularly long bill, I'd stick with the ID. And, you know, another reason is, look at the bottom left thing. You know, a lot of the time when these birds are feeding, you don't see the bill. You know, the bill is going in and out the water, etc. It's really quite hard to see. Shape is useful, at least for adults. So I'm looking at the top left-hand picture for those of you online. Long-billed dowitchers, and you may have to look at birds for a while to make sure you're looking at the shape, but they kind of famously have this much more of a rounded back in a relaxed feeding position. And you have to look at a bird for a while to make sure you're getting the right sense of the shape. A short-billed dowitcher, this is a juvenile short-billed, you can tell by those bright feathers, are much flatter backed. And that's super helpful as well. So again, if you're looking through thousands of dowitchers and it's midsummer and there's many few long-billed and you want to find your long-billed for the day, that's a really helpful thing to clue on. I find it much helpful when you're looking at juveniles in fall, because the juveniles are not long-billed, they're not as big-bodied. If you look at the bottom left-hand panel, so this is a juvenile long-billed, and here's a juvenile short-billed. One of the things, by the way, it's showing is this, you can see it here, but winter long-billed dowitchers have a kind of really distinctive gray bib, which the juveniles also have. But, it's got the plain tertials. It is a bit more rounded and, maybe that photo isn't showing it very well. But you've got to be a little bit cautious, particularly if you're seeing adult and juvenile long-billed dowitchers together. The juveniles will look thinner bodied than the adults. So just be a bit careful about using the shape. A couple of one other thing that can be helpful is on flying birds. You may need to take a photograph for some of this, but the long-billed dowitchers in our area, the adults will be molting their wing feathers in late summer. They molt because they kind of winter closer in the area. So, they start to molt their wing feathers. The short-billed dowitchers tend not to do that. I would hesitate to say never, because, they don't winter too far from here. They winter a bit further south down the coast, but they tend not to have wing molt. So if you see a dowitcher flying around with wing molt, there's a really good clue it's a long-billed dowitcher. Scott, you asked a question about bill length. I guess this one, which is a long-billed dowitcher, I'm looking at the top right-hand photo, the bottom bird. Its bill does look a little bit longer, doesn't it? But, you may need a photo to see that. Something else which is, again, kind of useful on photos is the underwing is very uniform under the short-billed dowitcher, and the long-billed have this white leading edge on the inner part of the wing. But again, that's kind of tough to see. But again, you can... Okay, so that's a reminder for me to pick up the pace a bit. So one thing that I don't find helpful is that people talked about the amount of white on the tail, not super helpful, because most of the time you can't see the tail, and it overlaps. And bill shape, I think, is not terribly useful, because it's a bit variable. So we've done the tougher birds. Here's some of the easier part. We can go a bit quicker. Godwits, always, pretty rare in our area. Easiest to find in late fall, September, October. You can get double-digit Hudsonian godwits out at Bombay Hook. Marble godwit we can even get in winter. They're kind of the same shape. They're very different in size. And the Hudsonian godwit, you do see them sometimes in late summer, this very rich rufous color underneath, but most of the time they're really quite a brownish gray. When they fly, I'm looking at the right-hand photos, really distinctive of a white rump, this white pattern in the wings, unlike the marble godwit. And another large shorebird which we get is the willet. We get two types, so I don't want to spend too long on this because we've already gone on quite long, and but there are eastern and western willets. Maybe one day they'll split them. I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm not really up on the pros and cons of that. And apparently the birds in the Gulf are kind of intermediate in how they look. But the eastern willets are the ones that turn up in April and May. They nest in the salt marshes. They leave pretty early. The adults are gone by mid-July. The juveniles, sometimes you see them through till September, early September. And then the western willets start coming in. They're the ones that winter all the way down the coast. The eastern willets completely pull out of the US, apparently. They're quite different in size. So when you see them together, they're very different. And the eastern willets are kind of browner. They have a slightly different bill shape and a flatter back. Some of the western willets can look really big. And, when you see in late fall, winter, these pale gray birds like this bottom one, that's a western willet. And there's some differences in breeding as well. But it's kind of easiest maybe to sort of learn them by, the ones in the marshes in the middle of summer. Look at those, these heavily marked western birds are a lot smaller. And the big pale gray ones, they turn up later, they're the western willets. So do a little bit of ID stuff. Here's some large, I'm focusing on the large shorebirds and some of the challenges. So we've got 3 pictures there. I'm curious, the very top left picture, anyone want to have a go at the birds that are there on that, on the top left? Just the shorebirds that are in the foreground. There's a few in the back you don't have to worry about, but I'm going to highlight, what are these birds? This one, right? At least here, if you're out west, you might have to say, why isn't that a long-billed curlew? But we don't have that problem. Okay, so that's a marble godwit. Okay, I'm going to advance. Okay, here we are. Okay, so there's a marble godwit, then there's a Hudsonian godwit, and I put these pictures in here just to show you Hudsonian godwits are not all that big. Okay, so here's a greater yellowlegs bottom left picture with Hudsonian godwits. Here's a greater yellowlegs in the top left picture. Here's a greater yellowlegs, a bottom right picture. Hudsonian godwits are bigger bodied. If you look at it, you can see, yes, it is bigger. But it's quite easy for Hudsonian godwit to hide in a flock of greater yellowlegs. It's really not that difficult. They're actually browner. The legs are black. But that's one of the easiest things to do. They don't jump out. You think, oh, it's a godwit, it's going to be really big. Not really. In fact, it's a lot smaller than this western willet. At least it looks a lot smaller. But what you can see is you look at the bottom left-hand panel, they're much kind of browner. They're not really longer legged than the greater yellowlegs. But they're this kind of brownish color as juveniles. We've got a greater yellowlegs there. There's actually a greater yellowlegs there at the top left, so which are kind of a colder gray color. Obviously, the legs look different, but that can be hard in a flock of shorebirds, working out whose legs are whose. Sometimes they're all mixed together. So that's something to be aware of. Focus on color as well. Color can be helpful. Okay, quickly on plovers. We should move fairly quickly on this. The 2 bigger plovers, black-bellied and American golden plover. Black-bellied is obviously much more common, present in winter. American golden plover, they do turn up round about now on the Delaware Bay, actually. But typically it's a late August, September usually. Some movement in spring, but not usually. When they're flying, easy to tell. I'm looking at the bottom right-hand panel for those of you online. The black-bellied plover have this, it really should be called the black arm-pitted plover because it has that throughout the year. In fact, we call them in Britain, we call them grey plovers because they're a really common wintering bird, as is the European golden plover, which are kind of yellowish. So a lot of the year, black-bellied plover, this grayish color and breeding plumage, they have the limited black underparts, but very distinctive wing bar. I'm going to compare, for those of you online, I'm going to compare juvenile birds on the bottom left panel. And one of the black-bellied plovers actually looks kind of buffish. It's almost about the same color you would see in an American golden plover. But you can actually see the black armpits there and the bold white stripe. And next to it is a juvenile American golden plover. And they always have this very strong capped appearance with a white supercilium, I find. And of course, they have a smaller, finer bill. They have a longer wing projection. When you do see them together, as you can see in the birds that are flying, the American golden plover is a more delicate looking bird. We see top right, we see a lot. And they're also very distinctive because they still seem to retain a sort of a blackish, enough blackish around the face to have a really strong capped effect. They still have that dark cap and a white stripe. We don't see many in breeding, but if you do, the male is completely extensive black underparts. But black-bellied much more common. But again, if you go late August, September, shorebirding on the coast, you got a good chance of seeing American golden plover. And of course, they like grass as well. Smaller plovers, which are actually pretty easy to tell apart. Semi-palmated plover, which is extremely common. And I just gratuitously put in a killdeer because I didn't have anywhere else to put it. But much bigger than both. birds. I suppose it could be confusion with a young, a baby killdeer, and they have that double breast band and a very long tail. But they're kind of fairly similar in shape, the piping plover and semi-palmated plover, obviously extremely different in color. And of course, you'll see them together in late summer running around. If you go hike around Assateague Island, you often see them together, the same area. You see them together in winter in Florida, but always a very different color. Piping plovers are super pale. And now I've kind of got to the stuff. I did the harder ID stuff earlier, so now we're just running through the more distinctive stuff. And there's not very much that looks like a red knot. Unfortunately, much less common than they used to be. Really, you do see them a bit in fall, and occasionally there's one hanging around Ocean City in winter, but not regularly. But, go in late May, and there's still, you can still see a number, nothing like it used to be on the Delaware Bay. And of course, at that time of year, they're in this superb color, this rich reddish rufous color underneath, and very uniform above. And then they go to this very pale grayish color. They're quite big. So they are distinctly bigger than any of the other calidrids we've looked at. Their body size, I don't know exactly. It must be kind of about the same as a short-billed dowitcher, actually, in terms of body size. A bit smaller than a black-bellied plover. A couple of grass pipers, partly because I really like these birds, which the only thing they've got in common is they can be in the same area, but they really don't look very similar. There's the upland sandpiper and buff-breasted sandpiper. And they're both kind of brownish, but the upland sandpiper is this really distinctive shape. If you look on the top left, a very thin neck and a pigeon head, very long tail, very distinctive in flight as well. Often, you just see the top part of the bird from the neck up because they like going in quite tall grass. So you just see the head sticking up. Buff-breasted, we're used to really seeing this bird from late August through to most of September, occasionally later on turf farms, muddy areas. Really nice looking bird, about the same size as a pectoral sandpiper, but not as brownish. It's more of a clay colored and buff on the front. They like grass, but will go in mud. Very uniform when they fly, apart from a really white underneath. I can't remember if I've ever heard a buff-breasted sandpiper call. If they do, I can't even remember what it is. On the other hand, upland sandpipers, sometimes I've only realized they're there because they have this bubbling call when they fly, and they call a lot, actually. And so sometimes, they're flying over because they give this bubbling call. More distinctive birds that occur on rocks. Well, the one on the left does. The purple sandpiper. When you're seeing them in winter, the thing you have to distinguish it from is dunlin, which are kind of a grayish color as well. They're not as squat. You can see this is a rock bird. It's got, really short legs close to the ground, happy to live on these wave rocks, and very bright legs. Dunlin would be body size, not quite as dark, but have black legs and be a bit more elongated. And of course, you see turnstone you also see turnstone in the spring and summer along the Delaware Bay. And they are super bright in midsummer. These really white heads, really rufous underneath. A lot of these birds, by the way, there's a big banding operation up in the Delaware Bay. At Mispillion Light, probably where a lot of this stuff gets banded. I presume it's okay for the birds, but they shoot a cannon over flocks of birds and ban them. And they put these on them, these leg flags. So if you ever see a bird with this and you can read it, make a note of it, and then go on to the bird banding lab site and report them, because they find it really helpful to know who's seeing their birds. And I think we're almost at the end, and what better way to end than on phalaropes. So phalaropes, really prized birds, tough to find. For some reason, I mentioned Poplar Island, but the Dredge Islands in the Chesapeake Bay seem to have them more regularly than even the Delaware Bay sites do. I don't know why that is. The two we tend to see, unless you've got a pelagic, are the red-necked and Wilsons, and Wilsons is probably the most common. They're kind of quite similar. They both have a bit of reddish on the neck in summer, and kind of palish gray. Wilson's is bigger, and actually doesn't always swim, does sometimes run around like the other shorebirds, has a longer bill, a longer neck. Juvenile redneck phalaropes are often super distinctive with these really stripes on them and dark cap and dark cheek. Whereas the Wilsons, by the time we get them, even the juveniles have got lots of pale gray on them. And here's a mixed flock of phalaropes. I think this was taken in Arizona, by the way, just in case anyone's wondering how they missed all the mixed phalarope flocks. Okay, so Wilson's phalaropes, you can see in this, I've put arrows to them. You know, they're distinctly long neck birds, longer bills, paler. You can see the redneck phalaropes in the center. They've got stripier backs. They've got that bold black patch, shorter bills. But, you know, they both like swimming around. Of the three phalaropes, the Wilson's is the only one that is not marine. You will not see that on a pelagic swimming around the ocean. That would be pretty amazing if you did. And of course, very occasionally, we get red phalaropes. Well, actually, I shouldn't say that. You can see them pretty reliably if you go on a winter pelagic, which is why this was taken on the one in December, last December. You know, you can see pretty good numbers of them, actually. Whereas if you go on summer pelagics, you see redneck phalaropes. They used to do occasionally, or at least they have done, pelagics in the first half of May, I think, out of Ocean City. And they would get both rednecked and red, and you would see red phalaropes like this. It's pretty much the only way to see them here. This picture was taken in Alaska, but also shows these are really different shaped birds. The redneck phalarope, much smaller, has this needle bill. Red phalarope has a much thicker bill. Conceivably in fall, you know, late fall, you could get red phalaropes turning up. They have a very plain back. The redneck phalarope in winter has some stripes on its back, and there's a difference in the underwing. But a distant grayish phalarope could be kind of hard, actually, to tell apart. And very occasionally, red phalaropes have turned up in. There was one that years ago spent a couple of weeks at Blackwater, actually. I don't know. I saw it. I don't know whether anyone else online saw it. But okay, so I think we must be near time. So we didn't do a lot about shorebirds in flight, but I'm going to go through several pictures and we'll anyone wants to stick around. I've got a few more slides after that, but I know we're kind of late. So we won't try and name them all, but does anyone want to call out shorebirds they're seeing there? The ones with the white V up, inverted V up the back, are going to be Darwichers. These ones are Dunlins. There is a plover, yes. Black-bellied plover. Let's put names on them, actually. So I haven't named them all because that'd be totally confusing. There'd be an alphabet soup all over the place. You see, we've got a couple of stilt sandpipers. They have this white rump and a curved bill, slightly curved bill, and a lesser yellow legs about the same size, shorter bill and more restricted white rump. Quite a few Dunlin, you know, kind of dark above with a white wing stripe. Darwichers, I don't actually know which Darwichers there are, you know, just showing that, you know, sometimes you let them go. And black-bellied plover, and I think that's it. I don't see anything else. All right, spring. I see we still have that green scratch. I wonder where that came from. Anyway, I'll have to leave that puzzle for later. So as I was saying, if you do get out late May, this is when you see the color in shorebirds. And it's doing it just for that, also to see red knots. So here we've got what, 5 species? We've got a out of focus short-billed Darwicher. So long-billed Darwichers, by the way, I forgot to mention, really like fresh birds mostly. The birds, the Darwichers that run around with all these other shorebirds on the Delaware Bay and in the spring, they're short-billed Darwichers. Nearly all Griseus, a few Hendersoni. We've got some semi-sand, which we can see is much smaller than Dunlin and Sanderlings. So again, size is super helpful. You know, it helps these birds are in breeding plumage as well, but you can see the difference in shape between the Dunlin and the semi-sand as well. And the Sanderlings are just coming into their breeding plumage. Okay, we had this picture earlier, remember? I had it at the start. So there's a whole bunch of shorebirds on there. This is to highlight this thing about a lot of them are the same color. There's one really good shorebird at the top left, up here, which is always a nice bird to see. So, you know, it's big, that long, slightly upturned bill. And then we've got a collection of other birds. So reveal what they are. And I haven't, again, named all the shorebirds, but the Hudsonian godwit here. So, you know, you can tell it's a godwit by that bill, size. Of course, marble godwit would be a very different color. Actually, all other godwits, which would be the other two, would be super rare, are also a different size. So we've got a few other birds here. We've got a lot of dunlin, you know, kind of mid-sized brownish birds. You know, we've got dowitchers. I'm pretty certain these two, which I've labeled are long-billed dowitchers, you know, they've got that, they look very big and rotund, and they've got that very distinct grayish chest band. I'm kind of guessing that this one on the left is a short-billed dowitcher. It looked a bit thinner, but I'm not 100% sure. There's a lesser yellow legs there. You know, it's got a distinct, fairly shortish bill, distinct eye stripe. By the way, I didn't label it, but I'm pretty sure this bird here in front of the Hudsonian godwit, the one right in front of it, I'm pretty sure that's a short-billed dowitcher because it's a dowitcher and the cap looks very rusty, which would be consistent with a juvenile short-billed dowitcher. And hiding down here is a peep, which I'm pretty sure is a semi-palmated sandpiper for two reasons. The bill doesn't look very long, and it's got a very solid dark cap. This is early October. You really wouldn't expect a Western sandpiper to look like that. Lots of dunlin. Wasn't entirely sure what this one is. I'm pretty sure this is going to be a dunlin, but I'm not 100% sure. Kind of looks a bit long at the back, actually, but probably is a dunlin. Okay, so just to finish, I didn't spend much time on these. We've got some really distinctive shorebirds, which, you know, almost immediately recognizable. Stilt, avocet, oystercatcher, and whimbrel. Whimbrel's kind of tough to see apart from along the coast, and it passes through. And here are some of the spots you can go to. You have to sign up for trips to go to Poplar, Swan Creek, and Hart Miller Island. These are the dredge spoil areas from the Chesapeake Bay. Hart Miller is not as good as it used to be. Poplar Island is really good, but I kind of don't understand right now the sign-up process. Of course, the Delaware Bay is good year-round, and that's where I go. Bombay Hook is only 2 hours drive from this area, and it is, you know, it is world-class shorebirding most of the year. It's not in Maryland, so I know that counts against it for some people who do lots of state listing, but you know, it's in Delaware. But you know, the shorebirds don't seem to mind. And coastal Worcester County is also very good. There are some spots, you know, ponds, and also the mud flats, etc. So I should probably stop there. I've got a few more slides, but I don't know whether we've got time. I've got 3 more slides, but on rarer birds. Okay, so I'm going to cover the 3 most regularly seen rare shorebirds. Ruff is a really distinctive shape and often color, but we don't usually see them in breeding plumage, but this one is losing it, the male. But they have this is a terrible photo, but it really shows the shape. This big fat body and a very small head, you know, and that's true both of the male, which this is, and the female. They're mostly seen, you know, spring through early summer. And they hang around with yellow legs. The female is a bit bigger than the lesser yellow legs. The male is about the size of a greater yellow legs, but much browner. But the legs are kind of this orange color, but the shape is super distinctive. Curlew sandpiper are actually much less common than they used to be. Well, much less. People used to see several in one day on the Delaware Bay, but not anymore. This is the bird that actually turned up at Swan Harbor and unfortunately died. Actually, it's in someone's freezer still, I think. But it looks a lot like a dunlin, which is here, but the bill is a bit more evenly curved and finer tipped, and it's usually paler gray and with a more distinctive supercilium. And kind of it's a bit like it's a dark rump. So those are 2, you know, often we've seen adults which are reddish underneath. This is a juvenile bird, if you look at the feathers. So the adults are kind of like a deeper version of the red knot. It's really sort of deep brick red, almost like a long-billed dowitcher color. But, you know, they were kind of annual in the Delaware Bay. There was one last year, but it didn't stick around very long. And sharp-tailed sandpiper is more common than it used to, more frequently seen, I should say. It used to be about annual in the Delaware Bay in late fall. Often juveniles like this, they're a lot like a juvenile peck, but they don't have the pectoral area. They just have a buff wash, but they're very similar. And this is the adult that was at Swan Creek a few years ago. Was it 2017? And you can see it's got this sort of chevron pattern on the underparts, etc. But there are other birds which may turn up, but those are the three which are most often seen. And as you know, but there's many more species of shorebirds that have been seen in the mid-Atlantic, which would take another 45 minutes to go through. But unfortunately, we don't have that time. So I think that is the last slide. Yes. There we go. I'm going to hand this back. So as with everything, if you haven't done a lot of shorebirding, just get out and try it. Don't try to identify everything. Identify what you can and learn from it, etc.